as always with our webinars, if you've got questions or comments as we're going through, just feel free to interrupt me if you need to, or use the chat or whatever. It's always good to delve in a little bit deeper while we're at that point if needed. Ethical mediation. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Gunai Kuranai country in East Gippsland, and acknowledge traditional owners of Australia and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. What I've got prepared, just get us all on the same page about what is ethics, what standards do we have to comply with, what's clear, what are the grey areas, where can you get guidance, and some information perhaps about some check sheets and options, so on. So what are ethics? The definition, dictionary, are there moral principles. Ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or conduct of an activity, and morals are principles of right and wrong behaviour and what's considered acceptable in a particular context. When we're talking about our individual personal ethics, that would relate to our upbringing and all of those things, but we're talking about our professional ethics. So it's not quite as ambiguous as that definition would imply. We have obligations under the various registrations and accreditations that we have as professional service providers, and also as people engaged in commercial practice. I suppose it varies a little bit if you're working for a government-funded organisation or whatever. It may be other legislation that applies to you rather than consumer law, but the principles basically apply. The Competition and Consumer Act in 2010 replaced the Trade Practices Act, but you'll still people who refer to the Trade Practices Act, and that's administered by the ACCC, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. There is some guidance provided by the Commission for professionals. So for those of you that are setting up your own practice, it's probably a good idea to have a look at some of those guides and just run your eye over that. Am I complying in my practice, in my policies and procedures and that, as well as the specialist ones for mediators. So National Mediator Accreditation System has some information about ethical practice included in that. For family dispute resolution practitioners, the regulations specify some information we need to provide and also some of the behaviours that we need to comply with. We've got those. If you're a Mediation Institute member, we've got ethical standards that we've pulled from all of those. If you're a legal practitioner, if you're currently registered, then you'll have obligations under your state law society or body. And then if you've got another obligation, such as a psychologist or whatever, you may have obligations there as well. I guess the thing, as a professional service provider, the scope of our ethical standards and obligations are not necessarily just while we're providing paid services. And that's something important for us to understand. For example, good conduct is a requirement that we need to be a person of good conduct when applying for accreditation. There's a check when you re-accredit every 2 years. There's obligations to provide information to the Attorney General's Department. So that would relate to if you had, for example, a conviction of violence or child abuse or fraud or something like that, completely unrelated to your mediation practice, it's still relevant. We have an obligation to be honest in our dealings. Under all of our obligations, we have an obligation to respect the law. And I guess the point about professional private life. An example, we had a member who was going through a family law dispute and got himself very caught up and started making violent threats on Facebook, including sharing links on bomb making and all sorts of very inappropriate behaviour. And we had to suspend their membership as a mediator until he got himself, under control, basically. So that's an example of the sort of thing that may, if it comes to the attention of your professional bodies, even though it clearly wasn't related to mediation services he was providing at the time. These things do come to the attention of your professional association from time to time. Confidentiality, of course, we have an obligation to keep confidential information confidential, and we are not permitted to use information obtained for personal gain or advantage, particularly if you're working in a commercial area or family area or whatever. There may be instances where we become aware of information that could be used insider trading, perhaps, or just for the salacious purposes of a good gossip that we need to refrain from. We had a presentation not very long ago from an insurance specialist, and she shared a story about someone, a mediator in the US, who'd gone home and told his wife certain information about someone, and then the wife shared that in a group meeting publicly and ended up getting sued. You really can't go home and tell your family identifying information about clients. Would seem like it's an obvious thing, but it's also a very human thing to want to do that. Now, confidentiality is often used as a cop-out excuse. We need to remember that we also have a duty of care. In your opening statements, whether you're providing general mediation or family dispute resolution, you'd normally have something there warning people that you will breach confidentiality if you feel there's a need to protect someone from harm. Ethically, we should tell people that we will do that, and we should do that. We don't have investigative powers as a mediator. We don't know if someone's telling the truth or not. So unless it's very obvious and we're 100% confident that someone's lying, and I question how are you going to be that confident, we need to really take appropriate action. That might be contacting the police. It may be warning the other party. So breaching confidentiality to warn the other party that, credible threats have been made against them is appropriate. If we had a complaint on that basis, it's unlikely that we would find the mediator had done the wrong thing. So any thoughts or questions about that? Confidentiality comes up a lot if you're doing workplace mediation. What is confidential? Employers often want a bit of a blow-by-blow, a bit of a summary of what happened. And as a mediator, might be tempting because we want to get repeat business from this employer, which is probably the HR manager. So we need to be really clear about our boundaries. If you're going to provide a copy of the agenda for the mediation, that may be appropriate. You need to have that clearly stated that's going to be provided. If you're going to be providing the agreement that's written up to a third person, you need to make sure that people know, and not just tell them at some point at the very beginning of the process. At the point where you're writing up the agreement, remind them, because they may or may not want to have certain things in the agreement if they know it's going to HR or to their manager. That doesn't mean that they might not agree to do those things, but it doesn't have to be written. The same thing is, as a reminder, people own their own information. You can give people their information that they've provided or other information by agreement. It's common sense in a way, but it's also, I guess, something we need to remember not to just hide behind, if that makes sense. Looking at the types of complaints that are made about mediators is a good way of looking at some of that grey area around what is clear. Does it say you must not do this in the regs, or is it, can't really tell. When a complaint about a mediator is being investigated, we're looking at, is it relevant? And as I've already mentioned, with the good character requirements, it may be relevant even if it's not directly related to your work you've done. Is it substantiated? So there'll be a complaint manager allocated, and they're going to do an investigation, which is generally just a conversation. Our process is we record that. We do it as a video meeting wherever possible and record it. So there's no ambiguity about the recording's not given to anyone, but it's available if, let's say, there was a appeal made on a judgment. We can go back and see what the actual information was provided. And sometimes the mediator might say, yeah, I did that, or they may deny it, but there's no evidence that they have behaved properly or improperly for that matter. And then what's the cost and consequence? So the general categories, some of the issues are access to service. Those are basic consumer type things, not meeting appointments, being unavailable, those sorts of things. I don't really get a lot of complaints in that category. Communication and discrimination, they're really pretty common. Often our clients feel like you're being biased against me. By not agreeing with them, that means you're against me. Discriminating against someone because of a personal characteristic that they have. No one's allowed to do that, much less mediators. Failure to treat with respect. Once again, it comes down to our process is built in to be respectful. It's generally mediators that are skipping process, that are, not following a structured process that would have those sorts of complaints against them. Poor communication, attitude, bullying, rude, negative, patronising. Hopefully we're not doing any of those behaviours. Inadequate information, including incomplete or incomprehensible information. That's a really important aspect. And certainly if you're coming to the point of someone's made a complaint, if you haven't provided information in writing, it's very difficult for you to provide evidence that you have actually provided information. If that makes sense. If you just say, I tell them that. One, we know people are overwhelmed, they're anxious. So just telling someone something is, I would question whether that is actually adequately providing information or providing it in a format that's incomprehensible. You might know English is a second or a fifth language for someone, and you've provided a document pulled down off the court website that might be quite incomprehensible for them. Misleading and incorrect information. We'll go into that a little bit more detail, but that's some of the aspects as a mediator you may fall foul. So if you're overstating your experience, that could be a major problem. Being very clear about that. Failing to provide interpretive or special needs support. If you've got someone who's really struggling with English and you work in private practice and it's all too hard, you should be fine, just let's push through sort of thing. You shouldn't be doing that. It's quite okay for you to say, look, my service isn't able to support your needs, and refer them on to somewhere else if that's the case. Mediation's voluntary, and it's voluntary for us as well. You shouldn't be leaving people high and dry. So find a solution for them. Does that make sense? Yep. Facilities, I haven't really had complaints about that. That could be, let's say you're doing workplace mediation and you provide it in the fishbowl office of the workplace, and the person says, this is really, I'm not comfortable here, and you say, no, this is normal, this is what we always do, and push them to proceed, and everyone walking back, that would be inappropriate. Costs can be a problem. There's a little bit of a trend of people trying to provide all-in-one services, the mediation, and then going on to in-house lawyers and others. That's somewhat problematic. It's not impossible, but it's really important to be very clear about where the stages are, what services are being provided. It makes it difficult, if there is a complaint, to actually see whether or not you've provided the good information to people, whether there's implied that you're providing legal advice when you're not able to. You certainly can't provide independent legal advice even if you are a legal practitioner. That's a problem. Insufficient or incorrect information, overcharging. We need to provide information about contingencies and what things are going to cost. So no hidden costs. I recommend that you have a schedule of your fees. And if you're doing face-to-face services, what room costs and other things are included, what your cancellation policy is. So if someone's a no-show, you're probably going to be left with costs. It's no good just telling them afterwards. If there was a complaint, it's difficult to uphold that if people haven't been informed of their obligations. Does that make sense? And that's pretty standard consumer situations. Grievance is a complaint about a complaint. One of our obligations as mediators and as family dispute resolution practitioners is to provide people information about what to do if they would like to provide feedback or make a complaint. You should have information about that in your agreement to mediate. It can be to contact you first, but you need to provide a process, because sometimes people are worried about contacting the mediator directly. Most people don't like having difficult conversations and making a complaint directly to the person you're complaining about is difficult, particularly for some cultures like the classic Australian culture. Making sure that people know that. Otherwise, what will happen is they'll try and contact the Mediator Standards Board. for, which isn't responsive to contacts. They'll contact the Attorney General's department if you're an FDR practitioner, and they'll say, oh, tell me more, but they can't do anything, and then they'll direct it on to your complaint handling body. But you don't really want the complainant having to go to pillar to post to try and find out who to actually make the complaint to. And it certainly substantiates a grievance complaint against you when the inquiry comes from the Attorney General's department. So really important to make sure that's clear for people. We've had a situation where a complaint was made, the mediator was informed, and then the next thing we know, the other party has been told about the complaint and then started harassing the complainant about what's going on, what are you trying to back out of the agreement, and that's totally inappropriate. Unless it's agreed and appropriate, the other party would normally not be contacted in a mediation complaint, and certainly it's not appropriate for you as the mediator to be trying to talk anyone out of complaining or trying to get the goss from the other party. Privacy and confidentiality, that can be definitely a complaint, which may, depending on what's been done, may even go into a professional indemnity complaint. But access to confidential, inappropriate disclosure, or failing to comply with your reporting or duty of care. Confidentiality isn't just a one-way closed box thing. There are times when we have to breach that, and that is part of our obligation. And then professional conduct is really the major thing that we get. Failure to comply with practice standards, bogus claims, and that may be claims like claims to 100% success rate or something like that, which is very unethical. As a mediator, that can create some issues, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Sexual misconduct, obviously. So coming on to the parties is not a good idea. We finished the mediation, now we've started a relationship, is never a good look. So yeah, be aware of that. Incompetence. If we've got an incompetence claim, what we're looking at is what is the basic acceptable standard that should happen. I've had some where in family dispute resolution, there's been clear incompetence in regards to property settlement matters. So not understanding what's involved, writing up agreements where tomorrow you'll transfer the super when there's not been any discussion about procedural fairness, or they just don't understand what they're doing, which is quite distressing. Things like that would be definitely an indicator. Your agreement that you've written up will be looked at. The confidentiality of the mediation, it's not necessarily going to protect you or won't protect you against a investigation into professional conduct. There's information that the party is entitled to provide to substantiate their claims, and obviously your obligations. So if you've misrepresented yourself in your application or accreditation process, a wonderful ambiguous other. But look, ultimately, as mediation complaint body, we don't get a lot of complaints about mediators. When we do, they're usually in the professional conduct, sometimes in the cost, the communication are the highest categories, and most substantiated. The Australian consumer law that we mentioned before, there's quite a good guide on consumer guarantees, a guide to businesses and legal practitioners. You can get that from the ACCC website. And it's all about, you've got to provide services with due care and skill, fit for specific purposes, and within a reasonable time isn't defined. But a property mediation that takes 12 months isn't a reasonable time. That's people hanging out for a long time. If people are hanging on for a long time, you need to be moving them on, or perhaps suggesting that now's not the appropriate time and come back later, or whatever. Fit for a specific purpose. So that means if you took on a case where it's clearly not appropriate for mediation and perhaps you didn't risk screen it properly. So in a workplace context, there may be mental health issues or something that really made putting the people in direct negotiation inappropriate and has caused further injury. And in family dispute resolution, once again, not properly screening, not involving the party in the decision making about what's appropriate for them. Those sorts of things would possibly fall under there. That'd generally go through a complaint as an FDR practitioner, but falls foul of some of the consumer requirements. And we must not guarantee that an agreement will be reached. Okay. What that does is it sets up a conflict of interest with you and the parties. So it creates a pressure for you to force an agreement, perhaps when that's not appropriate. We all, as mediators, usually we're advocates for the process and we think it's going to be much better for people, but we can't get so enraptured with our process. Sometimes a bad agreement is not better than going to court. If you're in your advertising, where your key selling point was your high completion rate, you're potentially putting yourself into difficult ground, because it's definitely implying that you're more likely to get a result than someone else. So just be careful of that sort of thing in your copy. I've got a checklist that I'll actually, if you give me a moment, I can pop it into chat for you. And I will put a copy of this into the Mediator network. So anyone who's watching this later can go to the Mediator network and get a copy. So while I'm distracted, does anyone have any comments? Have you had any examples of any of these sorts of things I've been talking about?
With confidentiality, when the lawyers are involved, it can start to get really dicey. I can find it very challenging, because when I've got a client and their lawyer is then contacting me, I always try to get clear, unambiguous direction from my clients as to whether I am able to communicate with their lawyer and what I am able to communicate with the lawyer. And then you've got to always then remember what has been said by the other party and what you cannot reveal about what the other party has said. So it can be, I hate talking with lawyers. It's necessary, but because they are very artful at digging, and they're like, oh, what do you think's going on here? Yeah, I always feel like I'm walking on that tightrope when I've got the lawyers involved, especially, and then it's on both sides, and you're just like, oh.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when you're doing shuttle mediation or private sessions, we need to, the same, my habit is to do a summary of what I've heard and say, are you okay with sharing this information? And giving them a chance to say, oh, that bit, but not that bit. Or I'll send an email with the dot points and double check. But I don't know if anyone's got any other strategies that you use. Parties themselves as well, they often really try to get you to share information, but we can't. We have to be really conscientious about that. So look, this little check sheet, it's got some of the links that I've talked about. So the Australian Consumer Law website and the ACCC, Family Dispute Resolution Practitioners Regulations, and the National Mediator Accreditation System. If in doubt, find out. Call your professional association. We're always willing to talk with you if you've got a bit of a quandary and you're not sure. Talk to your professional indemnity insurance if you're in private practice. It's fine to talk to Samantha's. Definitely indicate it's fine to talk to her. It's not going to go on your file. Reach out into your networking groups and ask a hypothetical if you've got any doubts at all. And one thing, as a dispute resolution practitioner, you are registered in your own name. It's not good enough to say, oh, my employer said it's not me, it's them. Won't hold water. Part of the problem might be them, but you still have your own professional obligations. Just to go through this, and it'll highlight, yes, it's green. If it's no, it's red. And if it's I don't know, it'll be orange, and it'll give you a little bit of a thing to work through. Do my fees and charges apply regardless of outcome? So contingency pricing is unethical for mediators. It creates that, once again, that pressure for us to get an outcome. If you're only going to get paid if an agreement's reached, it's created a conflict of interest. So you need to be careful about that. And the same thing, do you have bonuses or other special success outcomes in your pricing? People coming to mediation from other industries where that's, common practice can be surprised that it's unethical in this industry, but it is. You can't do that. Referral fees. You may be, if you get out there and you're setting up your referral network, you may find people wanting to pay referral fees to you or wanting to be paid. So referral fees are very common in the real estate industries, for example. If you're setting up networks there, that might be, so just no, No, I'm happy to refer if you can provide this service for my client. I'm happy to refer them. I'm not expecting any payment, and I'm certainly not going to pay you for referring clients to me. It's just no. Referral exchanges. So there's nothing unethical about being part of a BNI or other referral network. It's just be careful you don't end up falling into pressure to produce referrals because there can be a pressure there, and you can
yeah. I can have a quick comment on that because I'm a BNI member, and the family lawyer in the group and we do pass some referrals to each other, but we have a referral list.
Yes.
So I have a list of lawyers, and I make it clear that any of those lawyers are people I would trust.
Yes.
So call all of them and talk to all of them and make sure you feel comfortable. So yeah, it works. It covers both of us that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's appropriate to get to know people, to work out what clients they work with and what services they provide. But yeah, don't fall into an exclusive arrangement or things like that. And certainly no inducements. In undisclosed in-house relationships, this all in, one-stop shop model that's starting to come out is you need to think about, okay, if I fully disclose this, is this okay? If it's not okay, if it's fully disclosed, don't do it. Don't do it. Have things at an arm's length. We need to be thinking about that. I know as more lawyers are coming into providing mediation services, some are also providing litigation services. It's very important to have very clear boundaries around what services are being provided to a particular client. And generally, I'd be very worried if one client is receiving legal advice from a lawyer from the same firm and the mediators from that firm. It's problematic and it would have to be very carefully structured. Any comments or thoughts about that? Has anyone experienced or seen that where it feels like the mediator belongs to a particular law firm and there's an implied bias there? That's good to hear. Excellent. Client confidentiality. So as your social media managers will be encouraging you to get lots of client testimonials out there and identify who the clients are, just think about it. How is that going to be received by the other party? Do you have permission? If it's a family law one, it's going to identify the other party. I tend to be on the safe side and don't identify clients in any client testimonial stuff that I do. I think it would be okay as long as everyone gives full and informed consent. I'd probably get it in writing if you were going to identify clients in that way. And you have to think about how would other clients think, oh, well, if I don't identifying the client, so how confidential is this mediation stuff? Yep. Mark, have you...
Yeah, just a question on that testimonial. It's not quite testimonial, but more things like Google reviews. You can't really control if somebody decides to put a review on there, and if they happen to disclose something that shouldn't be. Have you come across that, or do you have any tips on how to manage that?
Well, generally with a Google review, you've actually got the ability to approve it or not. In some ways, I guess it depends on what they say. The mediator controlled my scumbag ex so that they behave themselves in the mediation. I think they're brilliant. You probably don't want to approve that. And look, it's a grey area that we're going to come up more and more as the world changes and we have less control about the information that's put out there in groups, like family law groups, for example, for the FDRs here. People are asking for referrals and people will be putting up information about you, positive and negative, within those groups. You're not going to have oversight of that probably. So I guess it comes down to what can you control and think about how will that be received by the other party. I know I don't have a magic answer for that one. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I guess that makes sense to me anyway, in that you can't really be held responsible for something that's beyond your control.
Yeah. But if it is within your control, you can.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And if you become aware of something, now it becomes in your control. What steps do you take once you become aware of something? Competence and qualifications. Are you honest and transparent about your qualifications and experience? Not implying you're an FDR practitioner if you're not claiming experience you don't have, not claiming experience in a specialist area you don't have, and by reference. So it's challenging for new mediators because, Who wants to be my first client? You don't have to do that. But just have a look at what you're writing. Is it deceptive about your experience? Would someone reading that think you've been mediating for 20 years? The fact that you've been working in the construction area for 20 years doesn't mean you've been mediating in construction for 20 years. And it's fine to say you've been working in the construction area for 20 years and now you provide mediation services to help people to, deal with these complex and specialist disputes. That's okay. I've put it now in. It's not 20 years. We've probably all seen examples of friends or acquaintances that we know have just moved into an area and you see some of their stuff and you think, ooh, just be mindful of that. As a mediator, our life experience is relevant, but don't be deceptive. Costs, clear information in advance, including additional costs and contingencies. If you're bundling with other services, make sure your fees are clear, as that trend of people, various services collaborating together. It's a tricky area and you have to be very scrupulous about how you're managing that. Costs. Do you provide clear information about your refund policies? There's been a lot of chatter with lawyers lately saying, can I take payments in advance? There isn't a clear definitive guidance. Attorney General's Department thinks that if you're working as a mediator, you're not a lawyer or not working as a lawyer. The law societies, I haven't had opinions from all of them, but some of them say you're always a lawyer. So unless you've got a trust fund, you can't take money in advance. If you are a lawyer, still a practicing lawyer with a practicing certificate, talk to your law society and find out what they say. And practicing, and you don't have a trust fund. And you also need to be very clear whether you're working as a lawyer or whether you're working as a mediator, and not do both with the same clients. If you're qualified as a lawyer but you don't hold a practicing certificate, then be very careful about how you claim to be a lawyer as well, because that would be deceptive conduct if you're implying that you're a practicing lawyer but you're actually not practicing. Practicing, I wish they had a better word because it sounds like you're just learning. So for lawyers, having a payment processing system like eWay isn't expensive these days. You can get people's credit card details in advance, but you just run the fee through at the time, because sometimes clients, if they didn't get an outcome, they can sometimes use that as an excuse. Oh, I'm going to make a complaint now because I didn't get an agreement and I don't want to pay. If there was a complaint, it's your complaint handling body should be looking, did you provide the service? Yeah, then it's not valid. And sometimes what I've heard is that the threats of a complaint is enough for the lawyer mediator just to write it off and not try and pursue it, because of threats of complaint. Guarantees. We can't guarantee an agreement will be reached. You can guarantee that you'll provide the service in accordance with your agreement to mediate, but you can't guarantee the outcome. We don't control that. Even if you do an evaluative style of mediation, you still don't. And it's only if you were working as an arbitrator that you can guarantee there'll be an outcome, there'll be an award that you issue. Other than that, you can't. Informed consent. Are you giving them accurate information about your practices and procedures so they can make an informed decision about the services with you, including letting them know it's voluntary? So sometimes I've had issues where clients really didn't understand that they could stop the process. A mediation that runs for hours over because the mediator is so enthusiastic about trying to get an outcome, they keep the people there till late at night, and the clients don't understand that they can say no. We're stopping now. That's unethical behaviour. Even though the intent might be good, the behaviour isn't. It's taking away people's informed consent. But also, do we ensure the parties understand the possible consequences to refusing to engage without being coercive? So that's a big one that comes up in FDR, because the party too often thinks, oh, they called me up and they said if I don't agree, the court might put costs against me. That's true. You have to be good at explaining it to people so they don't feel coerced, but ultimately it's true. It's not bullying them. Terms and conditions. We really strongly encourage you to use an agreement to mediate or a similar document and get people to sign it. Okay? That way they've got that information. You should be going through it, not just getting them to sign it knowing that we're all very habituated to signing big pages of text without reading them. If anyone's ever bought software online, you do that. Well, I do that anyway. I'm assuming you do it as well. Just the key points, the confidentiality, voluntary nature, all of that. Honesty in your marketing, obligations. And if you're working for someone else, have a look at their website. And if you've got concerns, raise it with them. This is your professional accreditation. So if they're making claims on your behalf, many excuses through history of people doing the wrong things, saying, oh, the boss said to. No, let's not be like that. Obligations. If you're an FDR, we've got some information we must provide around parenting plans and types of things that could be in there. Are you complying with Reg 28? If not, make sure that you are. Professionalism, knocking copy, extending professional courtesy to other professionals. Under the NMAS standards, not considered ethical for us to be knocking other professionals. You may have individual professionals that you feel like knocking, but just be mindful of maintaining. It doesn't look good for you if you're going around knocking other professionals to clients or whatever. Insurance, complaint handling information. Professional indemnity insurance, are you keeping it current? We only check every 2 years. You're meant to renew it in the middle. It's important to make sure that you're covered. Conflict of interest. Okay, this can be a real issue for people working in small communities or within tight communities. If there's a potential conflict of interest, so some acquaintance, some past professional or personal relationship that you don't think is a conflict of interest, just disclose it. Get everyone to agree in writing to proceed. If there's a genuine conflict of interest, just withdraw. Don't risk it. If you feel like you can't be unbiased, if you feel like you're not going to be able to be neutral, then don't proceed. If you think you can, explain what the potential conflict is and get written agreement. A waiver is not adequate in our industry. You can't just have in your agreement to mediate, I waive any potential conflict of interest. You have to disclose what it is and get their agreement to proceed. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. And be mindful of your other professional obligations because other industries overlap their piece the same way the mediation industry does. If you have other professional things, you might make a little table and you basically just have to uphold the highest standard. And hopefully you won't have anything on your action plan, but if you do, I've even put one there for you. As you can see, I don't like getting complaints about mediators. I'm wanting to make sure as much as possible that you're really thinking about what could potentially impact you. And it's a lot of work to become a mediator, and it would be a terrible thing for that to be wasted. Look, it depends on what happens, how the consequences that might occur if there wasn't substantial claims. Those are those basic links, and I've provided them on that document. With regards to accessible information, we've got a webinar on the 28th. I've got some guest speakers who will be talking about accessible communication on the websites. One of the presenters is vision impaired, and so he often does testing of websites to see where, whether they are accessible, and documents and so on. So that's an interesting one. If you've got like a webmaster or team member who does that sort of stuff, feel free for them to come along. Very happy for them to be attending as well. There's a booking link on the website under the events or in the network. And hopefully everyone's already a member of the MI Mediator Network. That's an area where you can do a post and ask about a hypothetical as well. So if you've got something that you're sort of thinking, is this okay or not? You can put that out and ask your peers as well. I'm not sure if I'm actually sharing the screen. I'm probably not, am I? No. I got to the point of almost sharing and then didn't. Yes. So events, the accessible communication for professionals, 28th of April. Ken's doing a advanced skills on the conflict roller coaster, a model of conflict for mediators. So that might be interesting as well on the 28th if you're feeling super motivated in some PD after your long weekend. And Mediator Network. Is everyone a member of the network?
Yeah.
Yep, Good. So please feel free to start posts if you're looking at your documentation or how do people communicate certain aspects, and put a question out there. See if others will contribute. We're about to start up peer supervision again, where we just come together in quite an informal way and talk about case type issues. Starting up a community practice for supervisors of mediators as well. Hopefully we can create a little bit more of a community, a more visible community for support for new mediators. And I'll be encouraging co-mediation. It's such a great way for experienced professionals to share their knowledge and keep themselves accountable. So that's pretty much what I've got for today, and I'm on time for once. So have a look through, think about what your practice is, how you're cutting corners anywhere that's probably not a good place to cut corners, or are there any little blind spots that you might have had in your practice? Any comments, questions? Good. Excellent. Let's stay out there and be ethical standards for our industry. Thank you. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot. It was
Bye.
great.
That was really good. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Joanne, can I ask you one question before you go? It's
Yep.
not to